Thomas Reed spat blood onto the rust-colored alien soil. His combat armor, once pristine with Earth Defense Force insignia, now lay in shattered pieces around him. The battle had been swift and brutal, a reckless attempt to defend the human outpost against the Chronari war band that had descended on the colony world without warning. Standing above him, her 7-foot frame silhouetted against the binary suns, was Kavira, the warlord whose reputation had spread across 3 star systems. Her midnight blue skin glistened with sweat and the purple blood of Thomas's fallen comrades. The ceremonial scars that marked her shoulders and arms told stories of countless victories. "Finish it," Thomas growled, staring up at her with defiance. Kavira tilted her head, her amber eyes studying him with predatory interest. The ridge of sensitive spines that ran from her forehead down her back rippled with an emotion Thomas couldn't interpret. Her tail, a powerful 5th limb ending in a barbed tip, swayed behind her like a pendulum. "No," she replied, her translator converting her native clicks and trills into rough-edged English. "You fought with honor. You are the only one who wounded me." She gestured to the gash on her shoulder where Thomas's vibroblade had found a gap in her organic armor. Before Thomas could respond, 2 Chronari warriors seized him by the arms. Their grip was painful, their 3-fingered hands digging into his flesh. "This one is mine," Kavira announced to her war band. "My prize." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, all female, as was the Chronari way. Males of their species were smaller, weaker, kept primarily for breeding and domestic duties. Thomas had studied enough xenobiology to know this much, but the textbooks hadn't prepared him for the reality of being surrounded by dozens of these fierce alien women, each standing at least a head taller than him. They dragged him to their encampment beyond the ridge, where drop ships and war tents sprawled across the landscape. The Chronari moved with military precision, their war band a well-oiled machine of conquest. Thomas was brought to Kavira's personal command tent, a structure of stretched hides and metallic supports that dwarfed the others. "Clean him," Kavira ordered a smaller Chronari, perhaps a servant or lower-ranked warrior. "Tend his wounds. He is of no use broken." The subordinate bowed and approached Thomas with a container of luminescent gel. "This will hurt, human," she warned before applying it to his lacerations. The substance burned like acid before cooling to a soothing numbness. Night fell quickly on this world with its shortened rotation. Thomas sat alone in a corner of Kavira's tent, his wrists bound with energy restraints. He had been given water and some form of nutrient paste that tasted like savory clay. His tactical mind assessed his surroundings, looking for weaknesses, escape routes, weapons, finding few options. Kavira entered hours later, her armor removed to reveal the natural plates that covered strategic parts of her body like an organic exoskeleton. Between these plates, her skin appeared almost velvety. "Your kind has never interested me before," she said, crouching to examine him at eye level. "Small. Soft. But you fight with a ferocity that belies your fragile form." "We're full of surprises," Thomas replied, keeping his voice steady despite his exhaustion. Kavira's tail flicked forward suddenly, the barbed tip stopping just short of his cheek. Thomas didn't flinch. The warlord made a sound that might have been approval. "The others wanted me to kill you all. It would have been simpler." Her tail retreated as she stood. "But simple conquests teach nothing. I am curious about your species." "I'm not a specimen for study," Thomas said. "No." Kavira's mouth formed what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like polished obsidian. "You are a war prize. My property by right of combat." She stepped closer, her alien scent, like ozone and exotic spices, filling his nostrils. "But how I use that property is my choice." She reached down, a single clawed finger tracing his jawline with surprising gentleness. Thomas felt an involuntary shiver run through him, fear, defiance, and something else he couldn't name. "Rest," human warrior," Kavira said. "Tomorrow you begin your new life in my service. It need not be unpleasant, if you are wise enough to embrace it." As she turned away, her tail brushed against his arm, a brief, electric contact that left his skin tingling. Thomas stared after her, wondering if it had been deliberate. In that moment, despite his captivity, despite the deaths of his comrades, he felt the stirring of something dangerous within him, curiosity. The first week in Kavira's war camp tested Thomas's endurance in ways military training never had. Each morning began before dawn with the camp's battle preparations, and as Kavira's prize, he was expected to attend her during strategic meetings, though kept at a distance, still viewed with suspicion by her lieutenants. "The human should not hear our plans," growled Nexera, Kavira's second-in-command, her facial spines flaring with distrust. "Even muzzled, he remains an enemy." Kavira dismissed her concerns with a flick of her powerful tail. "What I claim is mine to use as I see fit. His tactical knowledge may prove valuable." Thomas remained silent, absorbing everything. The Chronari war band operated with surprising sophistication, not the mindless berserkers human intelligence had painted them as. Their battle formations utilized the terrain with cunning precision, and their technology, while different from human approaches, was equally advanced. On the 10th day, during a training exercise, Thomas noticed a flaw in their defensive perimeter. Without thinking, he spoke. "Your southern flank is exposed. A small strike team could penetrate there." The gathered warriors turned to him with hisses of outrage. Nexera advanced, hand on her energy blade. "You imagine attacks against us? I should remove your tongue." "Enough," Kavira commanded. She approached Thomas, her amber eyes narrowing. "Explain." Thomas pointed to the holographic display. "Your sensors have a blind spot here because of the mineral deposits. We, the EDF, used similar formations until the Battle of Tharsis. Cost us 3 battalions. Kavira studied the display, then adjusted the formation with several quick gestures. "Better?" "Better," Thomas confirmed, "but I'd position scouts on the ridgeline as backup." The warlord made the additional change, then turned to her warriors. "Implement these adjustments. Now." That night, Kavira summoned Thomas to dine with her alone. His restraints had been modified, still preventing escape but allowing greater movement. She offered him a cup of fermented nectar that tasted like spiced honey with a fiery afterburn. "You did not have to share that weakness," Kavira said, watching him over the rim of her drinking vessel. "You could have kept the knowledge, perhaps used it later." Thomas met her gaze. "And watch more people die needlessly? That's not who I am. Even though we are your captors? Even then. War has enough casualties without adding stupidity to the mix." A low, rumbling sound emerged from Kavira's chest, laughter, Thomas realized with surprise. "You are strange, Thomas Reed. Your people send transmissions calling for your rescue. They believe we torture you, that you suffer greatly." She leaned forward. "Do you suffer?" "I'm a prisoner of war," he replied carefully. "My freedom is gone. My comrades are dead. But no, I have not been tortured." Kavira nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Tomorrow you will join the hunting party. You will help provide for the camp." "Am I still just a war prize?" Thomas asked. Her tail twitched, betraying an emotion he couldn't interpret. "You are what I decide you are. For now, you are useful." She rose, her imposing height emphasized in the confined space of her tent. Useless things do not survive long among the Chronari. The hunt revealed new dimensions to Chronari culture. The warriors moved through the alien forest with reverence, reciting ancient prayers before taking the life of each beast. Thomas, equipped with a blunted spear that could still bring down game but would be ineffective against a Chronari, found himself working alongside warriors who slowly began to accept his presence. Mektera, a young warrior with fewer battle scars than most, was assigned as his handler. Kavira says you have good eyes, she told him as they tracked a six-legged herbivore through dense vegetation. She says you see things others miss. Is that unusual for a war prize? Thomas asked, pushing aside a bioluminescent frond. Mektera's spines rippled in what he'd come to recognize as amusement. War prizes are usually not permitted speech, let alone given responsibilities. Many questioned her decision to claim you. And what do you think? She paused, studying him. I think Kavira has never done anything without purpose. If she values you, there must be reason. Thomas spotted movement ahead and silently pointed. Mektera nodded in approval before they moved into position for the ambush. They worked together with unexpected harmony, bringing down the creature efficiently. As they prepared to transport the kill back to camp, Mektera said, "You hunt well for a species with no tail." It is impressive. Thomas recognized the comment as high praise. That evening, as the hunting party returned triumphant, Thomas noticed Kavira watching him from across the camp. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity to her gaze that made his skin prickle with awareness. Later, as he helped prepare the meat under supervision, she approached. "You are adapting," she observed. "Faster than expected." "Humans are good at that," Thomas replied. "It's how we've survived. The others begin to see your value." She lowered her voice. "Some grow concerned by this. They believe I show too much favor." Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth. "Is that what you're doing? Showing favor?" Kavira's tail swayed thoughtfully. "I am recognizing capability where it exists. Gender, species, these matter less than strength, intelligence, and honor." "Revolutionary thinking for a Chronari," Thomas remarked. "Perhaps." Something like uncertainty flickered across her features. "My position is maintained through victory and strength." Appearing too interested in an alien captive could be seen as weakness. Then why risk it? Thomas asked, suddenly aware of how close she stood, how her scent, less alien to him now, filled his senses. Kavira reached out, her clawed hand hovering near his face without touching. "Some risks carry rewards worth contemplating." She withdrew her hand. "Continue proving your worth, Thomas Reed. The path ahead remains uncertain for both of us." As she walked away, her tail briefly brushed against his arm, the second time she had made such contact. This time, Thomas was certain it was deliberate, a gesture whose meaning remained tantalizingly unclear but whose impact resonated through him like a tuning fork struck against stone. A month into Thomas's captivity, the warning sirens shattered the pre-dawn quiet. He bolted upright from his sleeping pallet, no longer in Kavira's tent but in a small shelter of his own, a sign of his rising status within the camp. "Raid! Shakari Raiders!" The warning echoed throughout the camp. Thomas grabbed the ceremonial dagger Kavira had permitted him to keep, more a symbol than a weapon, but better than nothing. He emerged to chaos, warriors scrambling for positions as dropships appeared on the horizon, bearing the distinctive crimson markings of the Shakari Dominion, the Chronari's ancient enemies. "Thomas!" Kavira's voice cut through the commotion. She approached, already in full battle armor, her face painted with ritual markings. "The Western Ridge. Now." He followed without question as she led him to a defensive position overlooking the camp. 3 of her elite guards accompanied them, including Mektera. "The Shakari will target me specifically," Kavira explained, her voice tight. "If they capture me, the clan fragments. I need eyes I trust watching the approach vectors they might use." Thomas registered her words with surprise. "Eyes I trust." A significant admission. They're deploying in a thresher formation, he observed, studying the incoming forces. 3 waves, with stealth units likely circling to the South Pass, Kavira finished his thought. Precisely where I would strike. She barked orders to her guards in their native tongue, sending 2 racing back toward the camp. Within minutes, the attack began. Shakari warriors, leaner than the Chronari but equally fierce, descended upon the camp. Their chitinous armor glinted in the early light as energy weapons scorched the air. Kavira and Mektera engaged the first wave that reached their position, their movements fluid and coordinated. Thomas maintained his position, searching for the infiltration team he knew would come. There, a shimmer in the air near the southern outcropping. The telltale distortion of cloaking technology. Behind you, he shouted, hurling his dagger with precision born of countless training hours. The blade struck a cloaked figure, disrupting the camouflage field. A Shakari assassin materialized, clutching at the wound in its shoulder. Kavira spun, her energy blade slicing through the assassin before it could recover. 2 more attackers appeared, and Thomas found himself weaponless as one charged him. Instinct took over. He ducked under the Shakari's blade, using his smaller size as an advantage as he'd learned in countless sparring sessions. With a move perfected against Chronari opponents, he swept the alien's legs and seized its dropped weapon. The battle raged for nearly an hour before the Shakari retreated, leaving their dead and wounded. The Chronari had prevailed, but not without casualties. Thomas helped tend to the injured, applying the medicinal gels he'd learned to use. Kavira found him as dusk fell, her armor dented and stained with purple Chronari blood and the greenish ichor of the Shakari. "You saved my life," she stated without preamble. Thomas shrugged. "You would have done the same for any warrior in your band. But you are not Chronari. You owed me nothing." She stepped closer, examining a gash on his forearm where a Shakari blade had caught him. Without warning, she bent and pressed her mouth to the wound. Thomas froze at the intimate contact. He knew enough of their customs now to recognize this as a profound gesture, the application of Chronari saliva, which contained natural antibacterial properties, was typically reserved for clan members or mates. "The Council of Matriarchs has requested my presence," Kavira said, straightening. "I leave tomorrow. You will accompany me. Is that wise? Taking a human to your sacred council?" Her tail wrapped loosely around his wrist, no longer a fleeting touch but a deliberate hold. "You have proven yourself in battle. None can question your courage now." That night, Kavira summoned him to her tent. The interior was lit by bioluminescent orbs that cast a soft, blue glow over the space. She had removed her armor, dressed now only in the minimal garments Chronari wore in private. "Among my people," she began, "to save a life is to claim responsibility for it. You preserved mine today. I'm already your responsibility," Thomas pointed out. "Your war prize, remember." Kavira's spines rippled in what he now recognized as a sign of conflicted emotions. "That designation no longer fits what you have become." "And what have I become, Kavira?" She approached until they stood mere inches apart. The heat from her body radiated against his skin. Something unprecedented. A human who thinks like a Chronari warrior. A male who acts with the courage of a female. Thomas smiled slightly. "On Earth, we abandoned such gender distinctions in combat centuries ago. Perhaps your people are wiser than mine in some ways." Her amber eyes studied him intently. "You have adapted to our ways, learned our language beyond what your translator provides. Yet you remain distinctly Thomas." The way she said his name sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. "The connection between us," she continued, her voice lower, "defies explanation. I have led warriors for 15 cycles. I have taken mates when biology demanded. But never have I felt." She trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words, a first in Thomas's experience with the usually decisive warlord. "Felt what?" he pressed gently. In answer, Kavira reached forward, her three-fingered hand cupping his face with surprising tenderness. Her thumb traced his lips, exploring their alien texture. "This," she whispered, and bent to press her mouth to his. The kiss was hesitant at first, two species discovering compatibility neither had anticipated. Her lips were firmer than a human's, warmer, but the sensation sent electricity coursing through Thomas's body. He responded instinctively, his hand rising to touch the sensitive spines along her jaw, drawing a purring sound from deep in her chest. When they separated, both were breathing harder. "Is this permitted?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. A warlord and her captive? Kavira's tail wrapped around his waist, drawing him closer. "I make the laws for my clan. And I have never desired anyone, Chronari or otherwise, as I desire you." Her admission broke something loose in Thomas, a barrier of resistance he hadn't even realized he still maintained. He pulled her down for another kiss, deeper this time, more confident. They moved together toward her sleeping platform, discovery giving way to hunger as hands explored unfamiliar contours. Kavira's tail was surprisingly sensitive, and Thomas found that tracing its length with his fingers caused her to shudder with pleasure. "Thomas," she breathed against his neck, "this changes everything. You understand that?" He did understand. Whatever happened tonight would alter both their futures irrevocably. And in that moment, as her powerful form pressed against him and her alien heart thundered in time with his own, Thomas Reed embraced the change without reservation. The ancient arena of Krondar gleamed under the rising twin suns of the Chronari homeworld. Carved from a single massive meteorite that had struck the planet millennia ago, its dark metallic surface absorbed light rather than reflected it, a pit of shadow despite the brightness of day. Thomas stood at the entrance, stripped to the waist, his skin marked with Kavira's clan symbols. Around his neck hung a simple pendant she had given him just before dawn, a fragment of her own spine shed during her coming-of-age ceremony, a gift of immense personal significance. "The human approaches the rite of 7 blades," intoned the ceremonial herald, her voice carrying across the arena where thousands of Chronari had gathered to witness the unprecedented event. "Let the first blade commence." Thomas entered the arena floor, immediately alert. Kavira had warned him that the first blade was designed to be unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. The floor beneath him simply disappeared. He plummeted into darkness, managing to twist his body to catch the edge of the opening with his fingertips. Hanging from the rim, he could hear the surprised murmurs of the crowd above. A human's reflexes shouldn't have been fast enough to react. Below him stretched a pit of writhing Krell serpents, venomous creatures whose bite meant paralysis and slow death. With arms straining, Thomas assessed his options. 20 feet across the pit, a narrow ledge offered possible safety. Summoning strength born of Earth's higher gravity, Thomas began swinging his body, building momentum until, with one final arc, he released his grip and flew across the chasm. His hands caught the ledge, and he pulled himself to safety as the crowd's murmurs turned to reluctant appreciation. "The first blade is past," announced the herald, surprise evident in her voice. Without pause, a door slid open in the wall before him. The second blade, endurance. What followed was a grueling test of physical stamina, a maze that steadily filled with water as temperature dropped to near freezing. For 4 hours, Thomas navigated the increasingly flooded labyrinth, his human body fighting hypothermia as he searched for the exit. His military training on ice planets proved invaluable as he finally located the hidden airshaft that served as the escape route. Chronari warriors were known for their heat tolerance, cold was their weakness. The test had been designed to exploit that vulnerability, but for a human from Earth's variable climate, it presented a different kind of challenge entirely. "The second blade is past," came the announcement as Thomas emerged, shivering but composed. The third blade tested pain threshold. Thomas was secured to a frame while nerve stimulators produced increasing levels of agony without causing physical damage. Here, his experience as a prisoner of war on Callisto served him. He had endured similar torture before. As sensors monitored his vital signs, Thomas retreated into the meditation techniques he had learned during rehabilitation, his breathing remaining steady even as tears of pain streaked his face. When the stimulators finally ceased after 40 minutes, the minimum qualifying time, his legs buckled, but he refused assistance in regaining his feet. In the viewing box, Kavira watched with outward calm that belied her inner turmoil. Beside her, High Matriarch Duvor observed with increasing interest. "He endures much for one not born to our ways," the ancient leader noted. "He endures much because he chooses to," Kavira responded. "There is strength in that choice that exceeds mere biological imperative." The fourth blade, psychological warfare, proved particularly insidious. Thomas was placed in a chamber where holographic projections created increasingly disturbing scenarios, Earth burning under Chronari weapons, Kavira rejecting him in disgust, his former comrades condemning him as traitor. Hallucinogenic compounds in the air made the visions nearly indistinguishable from reality. Thomas centered himself on what he knew to be true, the weight of Kavira's pendant against his chest, the smell of her markings on his skin. Each false vision he acknowledged, then discarded, refusing to be drawn into emotional response. When he emerged, his eyes were haunted but clear. By the time the fifth blade began, a tactical simulation requiring him to command virtual Chronari troops against impossible odds, Thomas's body was nearing exhaustion. Yet his mind remained sharp. Rather than following conventional Chronari battle doctrine, he employed a hybrid approach, combining Earth swarm tactics with Chronari power strikes. The simulated battle ended not in the expected noble defeat but in unexpected victory. The assembled matriarchs leaned forward in their seats, murmuring among themselves. The sixth blade tested adaptability through environmental extremes. The chamber's conditions shifted rapidly between scorching heat, crushing pressure, and caustic atmosphere. Thomas utilized every piece of knowledge he had gained about Chronari physiology, adjusting his approach as each new challenge presented itself. When he staggered from the chamber, his body was blistered and raw in places, but his eyes remained defiant. 6 blades passed, the herald announced, genuine amazement in her voice. "Let the final blade commence." An expectant hush fell over the arena. The 7th blade, combat against a chosen champion, would determine everything. From the far side of the arena emerged a massive Chronari warrior, her body covered in battle scars and ritual markings. Thomas recognized her immediately, Drexana, Lithon's daughter and the finest duelist among the younger generation of warriors. "The human will face Drexana of the southern reaches," the herald proclaimed. "Combat continues until submission or death." Ceremonial weapons were presented, for Drexana, the traditional triple-bladed moonclaw, for Thomas, a choice of Chronari weapons he had never trained with. After a moment's consideration, he selected a simple combat staff, the weapon most similar to those he had trained with on Earth. Drexana circled him with predatory grace, her tail lashing behind her. "Your mate will watch you die, human," she hissed in their shared language. Thomas didn't waste breath on reply. He knew he couldn't match a Chronari for strength or reach. His only advantages were speed, unpredictability, and a lifetime spent fighting opponents larger than himself. The combat that followed would be remembered in Chronari oral history for generations. Drexana attacked with overwhelming force, her moonclaw slicing air where Thomas had stood fractions of a second earlier. He used her momentum against her, redirecting rather than blocking, striking at joints and pressure points that Kavira had taught him during their intimate moments. Blood was drawn on both sides, green smears on the arena floor from Drexana, red spatters from Thomas. The crowd's initial bloodlust gave way to genuine appreciation for the display of skill from both combatants. 20 minutes in, Thomas was flagging. His previous trials had depleted his reserves, while Drexana remained fresh. A sweeping strike of her tail caught him in the ribs, sending him sprawling. The moonclaw descended toward his chest. Thomas rolled at the last possible instant, the blade embedding itself in the arena floor. In the split second it took Drexana to wrench her weapon free, Thomas drove his staff upward with precision, striking the neural cluster at the base of her skull, a vulnerable point few non-Chronari knew existed. Drexana froze, momentarily paralyzed. Thomas regained his feet and positioned his staff at her throat, victory within his grasp. The arena fell silent, awaiting the killing blow. Thomas lowered his weapon. "I do not claim your life," he said clearly, his voice carrying in the silence. "I claim only the right to stand beside Kavira as her chosen mate." Drexana's paralysis faded. She could have renewed her attack, instead, she kneeled, offering her moonclaw hilt first in the traditional gesture of submission. "The seventh blade is past," the herald announced, wonder in her voice. "The rite is complete." The crowd erupted, their reaction a mixture of disbelief and appreciation. In the matriarch's viewing box, even Lithon inclined her head in reluctant acknowledgement. Kavira vaulted the barrier separating her from the arena floor, protocol forgotten as she rushed to Thomas's side. He stood swaying with exhaustion but upright, pride evident in his stance despite his injuries. "You succeeded," she said, wonder in her voice as she reached him. Thomas managed a weary smile. "Did you doubt?" "Never," she lied, her tail wrapping around his waist to support him. "But the council might have." High Matriarch Duvor descended to the arena floor herself, an unprecedented honor. The ancient leader studied Thomas with eyes that had witnessed centuries of Chronari history. "In all my years," she said finally, "I have never seen a more worthy demonstration of the qualities we value." She turned to address the gathered thousands. "The rite has been passed. The union is sanctioned." That evening, as healers tended his wounds, Thomas and Kavira received a steady stream of visitors, clan leaders offering gifts and alliances, warriors requesting training exchanges. Most surprising was Lithon herself, who came alone and unannounced. "I misjudged you, human," she said without preamble. "And in doing so, nearly cost my clan a valuable alliance." "Underestimating humans is a common mistake," Thomas replied diplomatically. Lithon's spine ridges rippled with amusement. "So I begin to understand." She presented a ceremonial blade, a peace offering of significant value. "The Council has determined that your union will serve as template for future diplomatic relations with Earth." After she departed, Kavira shook her head in amazement. "You have done the impossible, Thomas Reed. You have changed the mind of a Chronari matriarch." The formal union ceremony took place 3 days later, once Thomas had recovered sufficient strength. Under the light of Chronari Prime's 3 moons, they exchanged vows that blended traditions from both worlds. Kavira wore her full ceremonial armor, while Thomas wore a combination of Earth formal attire and Chronari warrior markings. From this day, Kavira proclaimed in the ritual language, "Your blood is my blood, your battles are my battles, your victories are my victories." From this day, Thomas responded, "Our strengths are united, our weaknesses shared, our futures bound as one." Their hands were bound together with a cord woven from fibers of both worlds, Earth cotton and Chronari silk, as Duvor completed the ancient words of blessing. The celebration that followed lasted until dawn, with warriors from all clans participating in the traditional feasting and combat demonstrations. Thomas and Kavira slipped away before sunrise, retreating to the privacy of their chambers. War leader Kavira, mated to a human, she mused as they stood on the balcony overlooking the capital city. "My ancestors would be scandalized." "Or impressed," Thomas suggested, drawing her close. "You've always been one to forge new paths." Her tail wrapped possessively around his waist, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "The Earth delegation arrives next month." They believe they come to negotiate your release. Thomas smiled. They're in for quite a surprise. Will you regret it? Kavira asked, a rare vulnerability in her voice. Choosing my world over yours? He turned to face her, tracing the line of her jaw with gentle fingers. I choose neither world exclusively. I choose something new, something between worlds. Something we create together. She leaned down to press her forehead to his, the Chronari gesture of deepest intimacy. The space between stars, she murmured. That is where we shall build our future. Their kiss sealed the promise as the twin suns of Chronari Prime crested the horizon, casting their joined shadows across the ancient stones, one shadow distinctly alien, one distinctly human, yet inseparable in the dawn light of a new day.